One border, two completely different worlds. There is a photograph taken from space that has circulated for decades, and every time someone sees it for the first time, they stop. It shows the Korean peninsula at night. The southern half is a blaze of light, dense clusters of brightness, stretching from Seoul to Busan, a constellation of a functioning modern civilization. The northern half is darkness, not dim, not faint, darkness, a black void where 26 million people live. One small smudge of grey in the center of that void is Pyongyang. That is all. Same peninsula, same people, same language, same blood, divided 70 years ago by a line drawn in pencil on a map. How does that happen? How does the same starting point produce two realities so different they look like they belong to separate centuries? That is the question this video builds toward. And the answer is not the one most people expect. It is not simply about one bad leader or one unlucky war. It is about what happens when a system is designed not to feed its people, but to survive itself. When a border becomes a laboratory, when isolation becomes policy, and the poverty becomes the mechanism of control, we are going to walk through that darkness, layer by layer. First, the moment of division and what it actually meant. Then, the economic divergence, which accelerated faster than almost anyone predicted. Then, the architecture of control that keeps 26 million people inside a system that requires their suffering to function. And finally, the question that everything in this video has been building toward. One that has no clean answer, and that the two Koreas have not resolved in 70 years. If you are the kind of person who wants to understand the world at a level that goes beyond the headlines, you already know why you are here. Let us start with the line itself. On August 10th, 1945, two young American officers, working through the night with a National Geographic map, drew a line across the Korean peninsula at the 38th parallel. One of them was Dean Rusk, who would later become Secretary of State. They had 30 minutes to make the decision. The Soviets accepted it the next morning. The line was not drawn by Koreans. No Korean was in the room, and no one at that table appears to have understood what they were actually creating. Korea had been a single kingdom for over a millennium. It had been colonized by Japan since 1910. But beneath the occupation, it remained one people, one language, one cultural identity. The division at the 38th parallel cut across rivers, roads, farmland, and families. It separated an industrialized north, where Japan had built its heavy industry, from an agricultural south that depended on northern manufacturing. On paper, in 1945, the North had the economic advantage. Think about that for a moment. The side that is now a black void on the satellite photograph was, 70 years ago, the more industrialized half of the peninsula. Do you know what your own country looked like in 1945? Do you know what was decided about it? By whom? In how many minutes? The Korean War erupts in June 1950. 3 years. 36,000 American soldiers dead. An estimated 3 million Korean civilians killed. The peninsula is destroyed on both sides. An armistice is signed in July 1953, but no peace treaty ever follows. Technically, the war has never ended. The Korean peninsula has been in a state of legal war for over 70 years. What the armistice produces is not peace. It produces one of the most heavily fortified borders in human history. The demilitarized zone, a strip of land 2.5 miles wide and 150 miles long, becomes a no man's land, monitored by sensors, landmines, and two armies facing each other across a corridor of grass and wire. It is called demilitarized because no active combat happens there. It is one of the most militarized places on Earth, and on either side of that wire, two radically different experiments begin. The South chooses, or rather is guided toward, a path of export-led industrialization under American security guarantees. It is not a democracy at first. It is a series of authoritarian governments that nonetheless allow markets to function, allow foreign investment to enter, and allow the economy to grow. Samsung is founded as a trading company in 1938, and by the 1970s it is building ships and semiconductors. Hyundai begins as a construction company and becomes a car manufacturer. POSCO, the steel producer, starts operations in 1973 with funding from Japanese war reparations. South Korea's gross domestic product per person in 1960 is approximately $1,200. By 2023, it is $33,500. That is not growth. That is transformation. It is one of the most rapid economic ascents ever recorded in modern history. A country that went from war, rubble, to producing the chips inside your smartphone in roughly 2 generations. Now look north. Kim Il-sung, the leader installed by Soviet backing after 1945, builds a system called Juche, a philosophy of radical self-reliance that becomes the ideological engine of the North Korean state. Juche argues that Korea must depend on no one, that true sovereignty means economic and political autarky. It sounds like pride. It functions as a trap. An economy that refuses to trade, refuses foreign investment, and pours the majority of its resources into military production cannot feed its people, cannot educate them beyond the ideology, cannot light their cities at night. Between 1994 and 1998, North Korea experiences a famine. The estimates are catastrophic. Between 200,000 and 3 million people die. The exact number is unknown because the state controls all information. The famine is called the Arduous March in official North Korean language, framed as a heroic struggle against American sanctions and natural disaster. The reality is more precise than that framing admits. Soviet aid, which had been subsidizing the North Korean economy for decades, collapses with the Soviet Union in 1991. The system has no mechanism to compensate. The countryside starves. The military eats. Here is a detail that does not need interpretation. During the worst years of the famine, the North Korean military budget is not reduced, it increases. That is when you understand what the system was actually designed for. Consider 2 people born in the same year. In the same decade, the peninsula was divided. One is born in Busan in 1955. She grows up speaking Korean, eating rice and kimchi, learning to read in Hangul. By 1980, she is working at an electronics factory. By 2000, she has a mobile phone. By 2015, her granddaughter is using high-speed internet on a device thinner than her thumb. The other is born in Hamhung in 1955. He grows up speaking the same language, eating the same food, learning to read the same script. By 1980, he is assigned a work unit by the state. By 2000, he has a radio that receives only state broadcasts. By 2015, he owns nothing that the state has not authorized him to own. Same year, same language, same food. Two completely different lives. Two completely different countries. And, between them, one line, 2.5 miles of grass and wire. Would you accept that trade? Not the poverty or the wealth, the certainty. The North offers no ambiguity about what your life will be. The South offers everything except the guarantee. Which system frightens you more? Leave those two lives behind for a moment and look at the architecture of the system that keeps the North intact. North Korea is not simply a poor country. Poor countries have poverty. North Korea has a designed poverty, a structural condition engineered to prevent the population from accumulating the resources or the information that would allow them to imagine alternatives. The Songbun system, a hereditary class classification that determines your access to food, housing, education, and employment based on your ancestors' perceived loyalty to the regime, was formalized in the 1960s and still operates today. If your grandfather collaborated with Japanese occupiers before 1945 or fled to the South during the war, your grandchildren are paying for it now. You cannot change your songbun by working harder or thinking differently. It is inherited like a surname. The information architecture is equally precise. North Korea has approximately 5 million devices connected to its domestic intranet, called Pyongyang. It has no access to the global internet. Foreign films, music, and books enter through smuggled USB drives, which are bought and sold on a black market that has expanded significantly since the famine years, when the state's ability to control distribution collapsed and informal markets emerged. The state knows about these drives. It executes people for distributing certain content. It continues anyway, because the black market is also now feeding people. The state cannot feed, and the system has learned to tolerate the markets it cannot eliminate, while executing the individuals it can make examples of. There are approximately 30,000 North Korean defectors currently living in South Korea. They are required to undergo resettlement training at a facility called Hanawon, where they learn how to use a smartphone, how to open a bank account, and how to navigate a capitalist economy. Some of them describe the experience of arriving in Seoul as cognitively overwhelming. Too many choices, too much noise, too many decisions that belong to the individual rather than the collective. Some of them go back, not many, but some. That detail is the one that sits in the air longest when you think about what freedom means, when the infrastructure of choice is something you have never been taught to use. This is the moment where the argument becomes its most consequential, because everything described so far could be read as a historical accident, a tragedy of geopolitics and ideology that played out on a small peninsula and now simply persists because changing it is complicated. But that reading misses the mechanism. The darkness in that satellite photograph is not a failure of the North Korean system. It is the system working exactly as designed. A population that cannot read foreign literature, cannot access foreign prices, and cannot compare their standard of living to anything outside the border, cannot organize around the idea that they are being failed. The poverty is not the symptom. The poverty is the technology. And here is the question that the satellite photograph has always been asking, the one that sits under every data point in this video. South Korea is now one of the most technologically advanced societies on Earth, with a per capita income 29 times higher than its northern neighbor, a semiconductor industry that supplies the global economy and a cultural export machine, from cinema to music, that reaches every continent. North Korea has nuclear weapons. It tested its sixth and largest device in September 2017. It has ballistic missiles capable of reaching continental United States. The Kim regime has traded the welfare of its 26 million citizens for a deterrent that guarantees its own survival. The North is not weak. It is dangerous in a very specific direction, and the South, for all its prosperity, lives within artillery range of one of the largest armies in the world. An army that has never signed a peace agreement with it. Reunification is discussed by Korean politicians the way certain impossible things are discussed, with the vocabulary of aspiration and the arithmetic of paralysis. The estimated cost of absorbing North Korea's economy into the South ranges between $2 trillion and $10 trillion, depending on the scenario modeled. Germany reunified in 1990, and the economic integration of East Germany into West Germany cost over 1.9 trillion euros over 20 years, and is still, in some regions, incomplete. The Korean gap is exponentially wider. The per capita income difference between East and West Germany at the moment of reunification was approximately 3-1. Between North and South Korea today, it is 29-1. There is a woman in Seoul, a former North Korean defector, who arrived via China and Southeast Asia in 2012, after a journey of roughly 6,000 miles, on foot and by boat, who says this. She says she misses the silence, not the hunger, not the fear, the silence. The North Korean countryside at night, she explains, is genuinely dark and genuinely quiet, in a way that Seoul never is. She knows exactly what that silence costs. She chose this noise. But she says the silence stays with you. That detail is not nostalgic. It is diagnostic. Systems do not only imprison people with walls. They imprison people with the textures they recognize as home. The photograph from space shows you two things simultaneously. It shows you the product of two different choices, two different systems, and 70 years of divergence. But it also shows you a border. And a border is not a fact of nature. It is a decision made in 30 minutes by two men with a map on the night of August 10th, 1945. The darkness is not destiny, but the people living inside it have no way to turn on a light. If this video made you stop and look at a line on a map differently, leave your answer in the comments below. Tell me, do you think the two Koreas will ever become one again? Not whether they should, whether they will, because that distinction is everything. If you found value in this analysis, press the like button. It takes 1 second, and it tells the algorithm that this kind of depth is worth surfacing. Subscribe to this channel because we do not cover the surface of things. We go down to where the actual mechanisms live. Share this video with someone who has seen that satellite photograph and never stopped to ask why. That question deserves a longer answer than most people give it. The content of this video is based on strategic analysis reports, estimated data, and hypothetical scenarios regarding the economic and geopolitical context. The information is provided for reference, independent analysis, and documentary storytelling purposes only. It does not constitute financial, legal, or investment advice. The images and materials used are intended to illustrate the arguments presented.